The Intergalactic Weapons Academy on planet Zephyria was the kind of place that screamed we take ourselves very seriously from orbit. Gleaming chrome towers stretched toward the purple sky, each one designed to look more intimidating than the last. Because apparently nothing says advanced civilization like architectural overcompensation. Professor Krell stood at the front of classroom Omega-7, his forearms crossed in what he probably thought was an impressive display of authority. As a Saurian from the Rigel system, Krell had scales that shifted from deep green to angry red depending on his mood, and right now they were doing a lovely shade of condescending emerald. His reptilian eyes swept over his prize students with the kind of pride usually reserved for parents watching their children's first steps, except these children specialized in planetary annihilation. "Today, class, we discuss the final examination," Krell announced, his voice carrying that particular tone professors use when they're about to ruin your weekend plans. "Each of you will demonstrate your species' most devastating weapon. This is not merely an academic exercise. This is your chance to prove your worthiness to join the Galactic Defense Council." In the front row sat Vex, an insectoid from the Mantis Nebula whose chittering laugh sounded like a coffee grinder having an existential crisis. Her plasma cannons were already humming with barely contained energy, casting an ominous blue glow across her compound eyes. Next to her, Thorn represented the Crystalline Resonance Collective, his translucent body refracting the classroom lights into prismatic patterns that would have been beautiful if you didn't know those same crystals could generate sonic frequencies capable of shattering molecular bonds. And then there was Zara from the Tentacle Worlds, a name that their tourism board really should have reconsidered. Her bioweapon pods pulsed with an organic rhythm that made everyone else unconsciously lean away. She had the kind of smile that suggested she knew exactly how uncomfortable she made people, and she absolutely loved it. These three had spent the entire semester engaged in what could generously be called academic rivalry, and more accurately described as a perpetual arms race with homework assignments. The classroom door hissed open with the kind of dramatic timing that suggested the universe had a sense of theater. In walked Jake Martinez, the first human exchange student in the Academy's 1,000-year history. He looked exactly like what you'd expect from someone representing a species nobody had heard of until last Tuesday. Slightly rumpled, carrying a beat-up lunchbox that had seen better decades, and wearing the expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Professor Krell's scales shifted towards skeptical orange. "Ah yes, our representative from Earth, was it?" He pronounced it like he was tasting something unpleasant. "I trust you've prepared something appropriately educational about your species' military capabilities." Jake set his lunchbox on the desk with a soft thunk and looked around the room with the mild interest of someone touring a moderately impressive shopping mall. "Oh sure, Professor. Brought the good stuff." Vex's mandibles clicked in what passed for laughter among her species. "That little container? What's in there? A strongly worded letter?" "Humans are a primitive species," Thorn chimed in, his crystalline voice resonating with harmonic overtones of smugness. "Their most advanced weapons are barely beyond chemical propulsion. Quite charming, really, in a quaint sort of way." Zara's tentacles writhed with amusement. "I heard they still use metal projectiles. How delightfully retro." Jake nodded along with their comments like he was agreeing with a weather report. "Yeah, we're pretty old school." He patted his lunchbox affectionately. "But you know what they say about old school." "What do they say?" Professor Krell asked, his forearms now arranged in what was clearly meant to be a "this should be good" posture. Jake's smile was the kind that made smart people suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. Sometimes the classics never go out of style. The silence that followed was the kind that makes you wonder if you should start running now or wait to see what happens next. Professor Krell's scales had shifted to a color that probably meant this is either going to be hilarious or terrifying, and I'm not sure which would be worse. Professor Krell cleared his throat with the kind of theatrical authority that suggested he'd practiced this moment in front of a mirror. "Very well then, class. Your final examination will take place in 3 standard cycles. Each of you will demonstrate your species' most devastating weapon in the Academy's reinforced testing chamber." He paused for dramatic effect, which would have been more impressive if his scales weren't currently cycling through what looked like a confused rainbow. "The demonstration that shows the most, shall we say, creative application of destructive force will earn the Crimson Star of Academic Excellence." Bex's compound eyes practically sparkled with murderous glee. "Finally, a chance to show these amateurs what real firepower looks like." Her plasma cannons began charging with a low hum that made the air taste like copper and regret. My people have been perfecting plasma weaponry for 3,000 years. We can melt through a dreadnought's hull in under 30 seconds. Thorn's crystalline form brightened, literally, as light refracted through his body with increasing intensity. How quaint. Melting things. His voice carried harmonics that made everyone's teeth ache. The Resonance Collective prefers more elegant solutions. Why destroy the hull when you can simply convince every molecule in the ship that it no longer wants to maintain structural cohesion? Amateurs, Zara interjected, her tentacles performing what might have been the cephalopod equivalent of an eye roll. Brute force, energy manipulation, so crude. My bioweapons don't just destroy the ship, they convert the crew into more weapons. Exponential efficiency. The three of them began what could charitably be called a spirited academic discussion, and more accurately described as barely contained homicidal bragging. Professor Krell watched with the pride of a parent whose children had just discovered they could use their allowances to buy increasingly dangerous fireworks. Jake, meanwhile, had opened his lunchbox and was examining its contents with the focus of someone conducting a very important inventory. He pulled out what appeared to be a sandwich, wrapped in some kind of primitive polymer film, sniffed it thoughtfully, and nodded with satisfaction. "And what about you, human?" Professor Krell asked, his tone carrying just enough condescension to power a small city. "What devastating weapon has your species contributed to this educational experience?" Jake looked up from his lunchbox with the mild surprise of someone who'd forgotten other people existed. "Oh, this," he gestured casually at the container, "brought Earth's most feared weapon." The classroom fell silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence you get during meditation, but the kind that happens right before someone says something that makes everyone else question their life choices. Vex's mandibles clicked uncertainly. "That's your lunch container." "Yep." Thorn's harmonic voice cracked slightly. "You're claiming that a food storage device is your species' most devastating weapon?" "Uh-huh." Zara's tentacles had gone very still, which in her species was roughly equivalent to a human holding their breath. Are you serious?" Jake's expression was the picture of innocent confusion. Why wouldn't I be? The laughter started with Vex's chittering giggle and spread through the class like a particularly contagious case of hysteria. Even Professor Krell's scales shifted to amused yellow as his four shoulders shook with reptilian chuckles. "Oh, this is rich," Vex managed between bouts of insectoid cackling. "The human thinks his lunch is a weapon." "Perhaps it's a cultural metaphor," Thorn suggested, his voice still trembling with harmonic laughter. "Maybe their food is so terrible it could be considered a form of biological warfare." Professor Krell raised one of his four hands for silence, though his scales were still cycling through shades of entertained amber. "Well then, Mr. Martinez, since you're so confident in your culinary armament, you'll demonstrate last, after the others have shown you what real weapons can do." His smile revealed far too many teeth. "Consider it a learning opportunity." Jake closed his lunchbox with a soft click and leaned back in his chair. "Sounds good to me, Professor." He checked his watch with the casual air of someone timing a roast in the oven. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." Something about his tone made the laughter die down, just a little bit. Not enough to kill the mood entirely, but enough to plant a tiny seed of doubt in the back of everyone's minds. The kind of doubt that grows quietly until it becomes the voice asking, "Wait, what if he's not joking?" The Academy's reinforced testing chamber was the kind of room that made you grateful for really good insurance policies. Walls of compressed neutronium, force field generators that could contain small stars, and observation windows made from crystallized space-time itself. Because when your students specialize in creative destruction, you don't mess around with regular safety equipment. Professor Krell's four arms gestured grandly toward the testing area. "Vex, you may begin your demonstration." The insectoid stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd spent her entire education learning increasingly efficient ways to make things stop existing. Her plasma cannons extended from her carapace with mechanical precision, targeting systems, painting the test dummy with cheerful red dots that meant you are about to have a very bad day. "Behold," Vex announced with the dramatic flair of someone who'd clearly been practicing this speech. "The Mark VII Stellar-class Plasma Devastator. Capable of generating temperatures approaching the core of a medium-sized star." The cannon fired with a sound like reality taking a coffee break. The test dummy, constructed from military-grade battle steel, simply ceased to be. Not melted, not vaporized, just gone, along with a chunk of the reinforced wall behind it. The air itself glowed with residual energy that made everyone's hair stand on end, and their insurance premiums increase automatically. Impressive range, excellent penetration capabilities, Professor Krell noted, making marks on his evaluation tablet, while somehow managing to look bored by the casual erasure of matter. The wall will regenerate shortly. Thorn, you're next. The crystalline being flowed forward with movements that suggested he was less walking and more performing a very slow, very deadly dance. His translucent body began resonating with frequencies that made everyone's bones itch. The Resonance Collective has moved beyond crude thermal destruction, Thorn announced, his voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and vibrate directly in your skull. We prefer molecular diplomacy. He raised his arms, and the sound that emerged wasn't really a sound at all, but more like the concept of sound having an argument with the laws of physics. The replacement test dummy began to tremble, then shake, then perform what could only be described as an interpretive dance of atomic dissolution. The molecular bonds simply gave up and went home, leaving behind a pile of component elements arranged in a neat little pyramid. Fascinating, Professor Krell murmured, his scales shifting to academic purple. Complete molecular dissociation without thermal signature. The cleanup crew will appreciate that. Zara, whenever you're ready. The tentacled being approached the testing area with movements that managed to be both graceful and deeply unsettling. Her bioweapon pods pulsed with organic rhythms that suggested they were less manufactured and more grown, possibly from things that had once had feelings about the process. My people believe in sustainable warfare, Zara explained, her voice carrying the kind of cheerful tone usually reserved for discussing weekend gardening plans. Why waste perfectly good materials when you can recycle them? She released a small, innocuous-looking spore that drifted toward the third test dummy with all the apparent threat of a dandelion seed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the dummy began to change, its metal surface rippling like water, as it transformed into something that was definitely no longer a test dummy, and probably wasn't entirely dead anymore. Bioconversion is complete, Zara announced proudly as the thing that had been a dummy turned to face them with eyes that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. Full autonomous function, enhanced combat capabilities, and an instinct drive to convert additional materials. Quite efficient, really. Professor Krell nodded approvingly while carefully not making direct eye contact with the converted dummy. Excellent work, everyone. Truly remarkable demonstrations of advanced destructive capabilities. Throughout all of this, Jake had been sitting quietly in the observation area, occasionally checking his watch and making small notes in what appeared to be a grocery list. He looked about as impressed as someone watching a mildly interesting documentary about tax preparation. Vex's mandibles clicked with satisfaction. I think we've established the standards here pretty clearly. Plasma energy that can punch through starship armor, molecular weapons that can dismantle matter itself, and self-replicating bioconversion systems. She turned toward Jake with what passed for a smile among her species. So tell us, human, how exactly does your lunch compete with that? Thorn's crystalline body hummed with smug harmonics. Perhaps we should adjust our expectations. Maybe his species considers really aggressive seasoning to be a weapon. Zara's tentacles writhed with amusement. Oh, I do hope he brought something spicy. I could use a good laugh after all that serious academic demonstration. Jake stood up slowly, picked up his lunchbox, and walked toward the testing area with the casual gait of someone heading to a picnic rather than a weapons demonstration. He set the lunchbox down on the scoring table and turned to face the class. You know, he said conversationally, those were some really impressive displays. Very advanced technology, excellent engineering, clearly the result of thousands of years of focused development. He paused to open his lunchbox, with the same care someone might use to defuse a bomb or possibly arm one. But I think you might be missing the point. The lunchbox opened with a soft click that somehow managed to sound louder than all the previous weapons demonstrations combined. Inside, arranged with the kind of careful precision that suggested either obsessive organization or ritual significance, sat what appeared to be the most aggressively normal lunch in galactic history. One sandwich, wrapped in clear polymer film, a small bag of what looked like fried potato slices, a thermos that probably contained some kind of beverage, and a single piece of fruit that was so ordinary it practically radiated mundane energy. The silence that followed was the kind that makes you wonder if time itself had decided to take a smoke break. Vex's compound eyes focused on the lunch with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle made entirely of disappointment. That's actually just food. Yep, Jake confirmed, unwrapping his sandwich with the methodical care of someone performing a sacred ritual. Turkey and Swiss on whole wheat. Made it this morning. He took a bite and chewed thoughtfully. Little light on the mustard, but you work with what you've got. Thorne's crystalline form flickered with confused harmonics. Are we missing some crucial cultural context here? Is this some sort of human metaphor? Jake swallowed and shook his head. Nope, just lunch. He opened the thermos and poured what appeared to be coffee into the cap. Guatemalan blend, if anyone's curious. Really brings out the turkey. Professor Krell's scales had shifted to a color that didn't appear on any known emotional spectrum, possibly because no known emotion adequately covered academic bewilderment mixed with professional embarrassment and a growing suspicion that someone was about to make him look very stupid. Mr. Martinez, he said carefully, I'm beginning to suspect that you may not have fully understood the assignment. Jake paused mid-sip and looked genuinely surprised. Oh no, I understood perfectly. You wanted me to demonstrate humanity's most devastating weapon. He gestured at his lunch with the casual pride of someone showing off a prize-winning tomato. So here it is. The laughter this time was more nervous than amused, like the sound people make when they're not entirely sure whether they're watching comedy or horror. Let me get this straight, Zara said, her tentacles performing what might have been the cephalopod equivalent of pinching a bridge of a nose. You think a sandwich is humanity's most devastating weapon? Not just any sandwich, Jake corrected, taking another bite. This sandwich. Made by me, eaten by me, while I sit here calmly discussing the finer points of interspecies warfare. He washed it down with more coffee. See, the thing about humans is we don't just build weapons. We become them. The mood in the room began to shift, like the moment in a horror movie when you realize the real monster isn't the obvious one. Take plasma cannons for instance, Jake continued conversationally, pulling out his bag of chips. Very impressive, very direct. Point, shoot, target ceases to exist. Clean, efficient, straightforward. He crunched a chip thoughtfully. Humans would look at that and think, that's cute, but what if we made the plasma self-replicating? What if we made it spread? What if we made it smart? Professor Krell's 4 hands had unconsciously moved into what body language experts would recognize as a please don't hurt me position. Or sonic weapons, Jake went on, apparently oblivious to the growing unease around him. Molecular dissociation through harmonic resonance. Really elegant science. Humans would absolutely love that concept. His smile was the kind that made insurance adjusters break out in cold sweats. Of course, we'd probably wonder what happens if you scale it up. What if instead of targeting individual molecules, you targeted entire planetary crusts? What if you could make a whole world forget how to hold itself together? Thorne's crystalline body had gone very still, which in his species usually indicated either deep meditation or mortal terror. And bioweapons, Jake continued, biting into his apple with a crunch that sounded uncomfortably like breaking bones. Self-replicating, adaptive, sustainable. Really forward-thinking approach to warfare, he chewed thoughtfully. Humans tried that once. Turns out we're really good at it. So good, in fact, that we had to make rules against ever doing it again. Not because we couldn't control it, mind you, but because we were afraid of what we might create if we really put our minds to it. The room had gone quiet in the way that graveyards are quiet. Except graveyards are usually more cheerful. Jake finished his apple and carefully placed the core back in his lunchbox. See, that's the thing about human weapons technology. We don't just build tools for destruction. We build philosophy. We build psychology. We build inevitability. He looked around the room with the mild interest of someone conducting a nature documentary. Every weapon you've shown me today is impressive, sure, but they're all just tools. Point-and-click interfaces for ending things. He closed his lunchbox with that same soft click, and somehow it sounded like a coffin lid closing. The most devastating weapon my species ever developed isn't something we built, Jake said quietly. It's something we became. The ability to sit calmly in a room full of beings who could vaporize me in seconds, eating a turkey sandwich, and explaining exactly why that should terrify them more than any plasma cannon ever could. The silence that followed was the kind that archaeologists might discover preserved in amber millions of years later, still perfectly intact and radiating awkwardness. Jake opened his thermos again and poured himself another cup of coffee, the sound of liquid hitting ceramic unnaturally loud in the quiet room. You want to know what humans do when we encounter a problem we can't solve with conventional weapons? We redefine the problem. Take our splitting of the atom, for instance. Professor Krell's scales had settled into a shade of pale gray that probably meant existential crisis in progress. Started as pure science, Jake continued, stirring his coffee with a small spoon that clinked against the cup like a tiny death knell. Couple of curious humans wondering what would happen if they broke apart the smallest thing they could find. Beautiful, really. The pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. He took a sip and sighed contentedly. Then some other humans thought, hey, what if we made this really, really big, and dropped it on someone we don't like? Vex's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely. In her species, this was roughly equivalent to a human forgetting how to breathe. So we built a bomb that could erase entire cities. Just gone. Hundreds of thousands of people turned into shadows on walls in less than a second. Jake's tone remained conversational, like he was discussing weekend gardening tips. But that wasn't the scary part. The scary part was that we built 2 of them, used them both, and then thought, you know what? We could make these bigger. Thorn's crystalline body was refracting light in patterns that suggested his harmonic frequencies had shifted to something resembling a very quiet scream. Within a few decades, we had enough nuclear weapons to kill everything on our planet several times over. Not just humans, mind you. Everything. Every tree, every insect, every microorganism. Complete planetary sterilization. Jake chuckled as if he'd just shared a particularly amusing family anecdote. And the beautiful part? We kept them all pointed at ourselves. Mutually assured destruction, we called it. The ultimate deterrent. Sure, you can kill us, but we'll make absolutely certain that you die too, along with everyone you've ever cared about and several generations of their descendants. Zara's tentacles had gone completely limp, hanging from her body like deflated party balloons. But wait, there's more, Jake said with the enthusiasm of someone hosting a particularly morbid game show. We didn't stop at nuclear weapons. We developed biological agents that could wipe out entire species. Chemical weapons that could poison the air itself. We figured out how to weaponize diseases, weather patterns, and economic systems. We learned how to destroy civilizations without firing a single shot, just by convincing them to destroy themselves. Professor Krell had unconsciously backed toward the door, his forearms moving in small, defensive gestures. And then, Jake said, leaning forward slightly, we realized we were getting too good at it. So we made rules, treaties, conventions, international laws specifically designed to limit how efficiently we could kill each other. Not because we couldn't do it, you understand, but because we were afraid of what would happen if we really tried. He finished his coffee and carefully screwed the cap back onto the thermos. The Geneva Convention isn't a peace treaty. It's a gentleman's agreement to fight with only 90% of our capability, because we all agreed that 100% would be problematic. The room had taken on the atmosphere of a library, where someone had just discovered that all the books were actually Necronomicons. See, every species we've met so far builds weapons to fight wars, Jake explained, packing away his empty sandwich wrapper with the methodical care of someone performing a ritual. Humans build wars to test weapons. We've been fighting continuously for our entire recorded history. Not because we have to, but because we're really, really good at it, and practice makes perfect. Vex managed to find her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. How many wars are you fighting right now? Jake considered this question with the thoughtful expression of someone trying to remember if they'd left the stove on. Define war. Are we counting economic conflicts, cyber warfare, proxy engagements, information wars? He shrugged. Honestly, it's easier to count the places where we're not fighting someone about something. But you seem so... Thorn's voice cracked across several harmonic frequencies. Peaceful. Jake's smile was warm and friendly and absolutely terrifying. Oh, we are peaceful. This is us being peaceful. You should see us when we're not. Professor Krell's 4 hands trembled as he consulted his evaluation tablet, his scales having settled into a color that could best be described as bureaucratic terror. The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap, filled only by the soft hum of the room's life support systems working overtime to process the existential dread that had become the chamber's primary atmospheric component. Well, Krell finally managed, his voice cracking like a teenager asking someone to prom. That was certainly educational. He cleared his throat, a sound that somehow conveyed both professional duty and the desperate hope that this was all an elaborate practical joke. I suppose the question now is... What grade do you expect for this demonstration, Mr. Martinez? Jake finished packing his lunchbox, each movement deliberate and calm, like someone completing a meditation ritual, rather than concluding what might have been the most psychologically devastating academic presentation in galactic history. He looked up with that same mild, friendly expression that had somehow become more intimidating than any snarl or battle cry. "Oh, I don't need a grade, Prof," he said, standing and smoothing down his shirt with the casual air of someone who had just finished explaining how to change a tire rather than describing his species' casual relationship with apocalyptic warfare. "You see, I'm not actually a student here." The color drained from Professor Krell's scales so quickly that he briefly achieved transparency. "I'm sorry, what?" Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small identification card, holding it up with the same care someone might use to display a winning lottery ticket. "Jake Martinez, Human Military Strategic Analysis Division. I'm actually your new colleague." His smile widened just enough to suggest that he found the situation genuinely amusing. "The Academy Board of Directors hired me after reviewing Earth's, let's call them, impressive historical records of conflict resolution." Vex's compound eyes focused and refocused as her brain attempted to process this information. "You mean, you're not a student, you're faculty?" "Incoming Associate Professor of Applied Psychological Warfare, to be precise," Jake confirmed, tucking the ID card back into his pocket. "I'll be teaching the advanced seminar series on comprehensive deterrence theory and sustainable conflict management. The board was particularly interested in my thesis on why winning wars is less important than making sure nobody wants to fight you in the first place." Thorne's crystalline body had begun resonating at frequencies that suggested he was either laughing or having a complete nervous breakdown, possibly both. "The Academy specifically requested someone who could help their graduates understand the psychological aspects of warfare," Jake continued, apparently oblivious to the various stages of mental processing happening around him. "Turns out being really good at building weapons isn't the same thing as being really good at using them strategically. Who knew?" Zara's tentacles performed what might have been the cephalopod equivalent of throwing hands in the air. So this entire demonstration was what, exactly? A job interview? "More like orientation," Jake said, picking up his lunchbox and heading toward the door. "The board wanted to make sure I could effectively communicate human strategic thinking to a galactic audience. Seems like it worked." He paused at the threshold and turned back to the class. "Oh, and before I forget, you're all enrolled in my first seminar next week. Introduction to Proportional Response Theory, Why Humans Consider Nuclear Warfare a Diplomatic Option." Professor Krell's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. What will you be teaching them?" Jake's expression grew thoughtful, like someone contemplating a particularly complex chess problem. "Well, for starters, I thought we'd discuss the concept of measured response. You know the human philosophy that says when someone hits you with a stick, the appropriate response is to systematically dismantle their entire civilization, but politely." He tapped his lunchbox against his leg. "It's all about proportionality, really. They break one of our rules, we break one of their planets. Fair's fair." The silence that followed was the kind that archaeologists might discover preserved in sedimentary layers, a perfect fossil of collective terror. "Anyway," Jake said cheerfully, "I should probably head to my office and start preparing lesson plans. First day of classes is always exciting." He looked around the room one more time, his gaze lingering on each of the alien students, with the fond expression of someone watching their grandchildren take their first steps. "Oh, and don't worry about homework for the first session. Just bring your notebooks and maybe a few antacids. Human strategic philosophy can be a little hard on the digestive system." He walked toward the door, then paused and looked back over his shoulder. "By the way, Professor Krell, the dean wanted me to tell you that they're renovating the East Wing to accommodate my new laboratory. Something about needing additional psychological shielding and trauma counseling stations." His smile was pure sunshine and concentrated nightmare fuel. "Apparently, my teaching methods can be a little intense." As the door hissed shut behind him, the remaining occupants of the classroom sat in a kind of silence that usually accompanies the realization that everything you thought you knew about the universe was not only wrong, but adorably naive. Professor Krell was the first to speak, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who had just realized that his comfortable academic world had been irreversibly transformed. "Class dismissed. Please report to the Campus Psychological Services Office for preventive counseling." He looked down at his evaluation tablet, which was still open to Jake's assessment page. "And someone remind me to update my resume. I have a feeling we're going to need a lot more insurance." As the students filed out in various states of existential bewilderment, Vex paused at the door. "Professor, what do you think he meant by proportional response?" Krell's scales had finally settled into a steady shade of resigned terror. "I'm afraid, my dear student, that we're going to find out next week. God help us all." The classroom fell silent except for the soft hum of the air recycling system, working overtime to process the lingering scent of turkey sandwich and the faint aroma of psychological warfare. Somewhere in the distance, a maintenance droid was probably already ordering more trauma counseling supplies. After all, the humans were coming, and apparently they brought lunch.